Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and we're back with another DDR5 overclock. This is pretty much a follow-up video to the DDR5 CL24 settings that I ran with this setup here. These are the system specs, so Core i5-12600KF. The motherboard's a Gigabyte Z690 Aorus Master provided by Gigabyte, so big thank you to Gigabyte for the board, and also a Gigabyte Engineering sample memory kit that's using SK Hynix memory chips. They're 16 gig DIMMs, and they're single rank. Anyway, yeah, so that's the setup. The 12600KF is on air cooling, which I use this air cooler because it's really convenient when you're like swapping CPUs and motherboards, because it's literally just sitting there. Like, it is not, yeah, it's not actually bolted to the motherboard. It's just, yeah. So cooling was a bit of a challenge for this, because in the previous video with the DDR5 CL24 overclock, I only ran memtest just to show that, you know, it was somewhat stable. But because CL20, like, overclocking DDR5 at CL24 is just dumb, because you just give up a ton of performance. Your memory latency, everything sucks. Everything about it sucks. So I didn't really worry about like running a bunch of stress tests on it, because it wasn't a setup that you should actually run. So the fact that the CPU cooling, it was not ideal, wasn't really too much of a concern. But with this configuration here, we are running 6300 CL28. And so now, like, this is kind of like, this is actually something I would consider using for 24/7 operation. And so obviously we needed, like, now I need to run the actual, like, sort of full array of stress tests that I usually do for memory overclocks, and that includes LinPack. And LinPack is very, very hot. And the reason you want to run LinPack is it hammers the memory controller of the CPU. Pretty much the only thing that is more intensive on the CPU would be like Y-Cruncher, or, well, for the memory controller would be like Y-Cruncher, but yeah, like, even like Y-Cruncher also runs ridiculously hot. So with the air cooler, yeah, the CPU is only at 4.9 gigahertz, because otherwise I can't run LinPack. Anyway, as you can see, it also ran testmem5. I'm just using the absolute preset for that, the ANTA 777 absolute preset. Mostly just experimenting with this preset. Other than that, like, we also have 700% HCI mem test. LinPack obviously ran 33 loops, which took forever. And yeah, then we have some like performance numbers. So PyPrime. Now, the thing with PyPrime is that this is very much a memory latency test, but it also scales heavily with CPU frequency. So at 5.1 gigahertz, the PyPrime, like, this CPU on water cooling can do 5.1 gigahertz. So, and usually for like my 12900K, I usually run that one at 5.1 gigahertz for memory overclock. So if you're thinking of like comparing the results I have here to some of the 12900K stuff I've done, the 5.1 gigahertz CPU overclock drastically changes PyPrime results. So while this is a great latency benchmark, it's a bit too sensitive for like to CPU clocks, but that's true of basically anything that isn't a purely synthetic memory latency benchmark. Which this isn't. This is actually trying to calculate some number of digits of pi. Yeah, in this case it's 2 million digits. No, prime numbers, damn it. So it's trying to find a, I don't know, doesn't matter. This is not a benchmark I run that, like, this benchmark is actually doing math. It's not just spamming memory access commands for no reason. So that's kind of why, like, I like it, but the problem is, since it's actually doing math, it is sensitive to CPU clocks as well as memory latency. So yeah, and anyway, so that's PyPrime. And the point is, like, yeah, you can't compare it with 4.9 with a 4.9 gigahertz. You can't compare the results from PyPrime against a 5.1 gigahertz CPU. Though actually, if your memory settings are bad enough, it is possible for a 4.9 gigahertz CPU to beat a 5.1 CPU in PyPrime. But yeah. Anyway, that's just something to keep in mind. So that's like a good non-synthetic memory latency benchmark. And then we get into the synthetics. So we have Intel memory latency checker, 50.25 nanoseconds as the best latency, which is about 2 nanoseconds less latency than the CL24 setup had, because running like at low memory speeds, your memory controller is slower. It's really that simple, and there's not much more to it than that. So yeah, 6300 CL28 just has less memory latency than 5200 CL24. By about 2 nanoseconds in memory latency checker. I think I did run IDA, but I can't see it for some reason, so I guess we'll have to rerun IDA. I also ran Geekbench 3. The memory test in this is primarily... Oh, I know why I didn't run IDA, because this has 105 BCLK right now, so we can't run IDA because the IDA performance results get screwed up when you BCLK overclock. So that's fun. But anyway, for a sort of like rough bandwidth test, we have Geekbench 3, which gives us 13,110 points, which is... The thing is, I somewhat suspect that the 12600KF at 4.9 gigahertz is bottlenecking the DDR5 in terms of memory bandwidth, because DDR5 has so much memory bandwidth. It's actually ridiculous. And at 6300 megabits per second, yeah, there's just a ton of memory bandwidth, because this is a bit low for these settings, I think. So it might actually be limited by the CPU at this point. But like the thing is, so for a good daily settings for DDR5 should be around 13,500 points, and so I'm not particularly thrilled about 13,110 points, but like this is not bad. It's still like it's a lot more it's a much better memory score than if you were running like stock settings, or even that 5200 CL24 setup that I had in the previous video. Anyway, so yeah, like we've got lower latency, we've got way more memory bandwidth than in the DDR5 CL24 setup, and it's stable, right? It runs LinPack, it runs TestMem5, it runs HCI memtest, it runs everything. Well, it wouldn't run Prime 95, but that's not a memory benchmark. That's like, it would crash the CPU because it would overheat, but... Actually, it wouldn't even overheat. I straight up don't think there's currently enough voltage for this system to run Prime 95 small FFTs. But anyway, like, yeah, compromised cooling... If we ignore the compromised CPU cooling situation, this is, like, actually a good set of memory settings. This is what you should be aiming for. Now, not all CPUs are going to be particularly thrilled about running 6300 megabits per second on a Z690 Aorus Master, or really on any of the 4DIMM motherboards in my experience. Like, my experience with 4DIMM DDR5 boards is that pretty much all of the high-end ones will very easily post 6400 megabits per second, and they will also all randomly stop being stable for no reason at that speed. So with this board... this was a while ago, but I basically did a test where I'd boot it at 6400, I'd run memtest, it would pass. Then I restarted the system, I ran memtest, it would fail. I restarted the system, I ran memtest, it would have like one, like it wouldn't, when I say fail, it would have like 2 errors, and then it would have 1 error, and I did that a few times, and it just never stopped like randomly being unstable at such a high speed. Admittedly, that was with the 12900K, and my 12900K's memory controller is garbage. But yeah, that is a real concern with pushing like high speeds on DDR5 with pretty much all motherboards, is that at the really high, like at high speeds, a lot of DDR5 motherboards will have retrain instability issues where like one boot it's stable and then the next one it isn't. So potentially, like if you're trying to copy these settings, I would potentially give up on the memory speed. Like, that would be the first thing I would sacrifice. At 6200, I've had 0 issues. Above 6200, I think it really depends on your CPU and your motherboard as to how stable things will be. Because, yeah, like my experience, especially once you hit like 6400, is just like it doesn't retrain on most 4DIMM motherboards. So, yeah. Anyway. So that's kind of like, you know, performance is good, stability is good for this, and now we're going to go into the BIOS, and I'll actually take you through all of the settings. So, yeah. Well, let's restart. I actually want to be able to see the postcode for this. I mean, to be completely fair, I'll just keep spamming the delete button anyway, but... And we're in. Oh, and I should, I guess, point out that I do have a fan on the memory sticks because for CL28 at 6300 megabits per second, these DIMMs need quite a lot of memory voltage. So if we go over to the VDD to like the memory voltage controls, yeah, let's go through the voltages first. So the CPU is at just 1.3 volts with low LLC because we're at 4.9 gigahertz, and 12th gen really doesn't need a lot of voltage at low frequencies. It's just once you want to go past like 5 gigahertz that the voltage requirements get really ridiculous. So yeah, also low LLC on Gigabyte motherboards sort of gives you the best voltage regulation. I have videos covering that. So yeah, but anyway, in this scenario, that's not really the priority here. Since we're not at a super high memory speed and the memory controller is running relatively slowly, we don't need a lot of VCCSA voltage, so the VCCSA is at just 1 volt. And yeah, basically, and running really high VCCSA can sometimes cause like instability issues. So yeah, like especially with DDR5 in my experience. With DDR4, it's quite different. With DDR4 in Gear 1, usually you need a lot of ECCSA to get things working at high speeds. With DDR5, since you're always in Gear 2, I mean, there is a Gear 4, but you shouldn't use it. So if you're like in Gear 2, you don't need a lot of VCCSA until you hit like north of 6600 megabits per second. We're currently at 6300 megabits per second, so that's really not a concern. VCCN is, I've bumped it up to 2 volts because this can help with memory stability a bit because this voltage is used for the, well, it's used for the VCCSA, like the internal VCCSA voltage regulator, but it's also used for the CPU VDDQ voltage regulator. Now, you might be wondering why I'm saying CPU VDDQ voltage while, you know, highlighting the DRAM VDD/VDDQ setting. The thing is, Gigabyte thought it would be really nice and convenient if they combined 4 voltages into one setting in the BIOS. So your DRAM, like assuming if you don't manually set your VDD2 voltage and you don't manually set your VDD and VDDQ memory voltages, this setting right here will set those 3 voltages for you, and it also sets the CPU VDDQ voltage. So if you want to set your CPU VDDQ to something different from your VDD2 and your memory voltages, you need to punch in, like, well, you use this setting to do that, and then you set your VDD2 and memory voltages separately. So this currently controls the CPU VDDQ voltage, so that's set at 1.35 volts, which is a perfectly safe level of CPU VDDQ for long-term use, and on most non-ASUS boards, you really shouldn't need much more than 1.35. ASUS DDR5 boards, in my experience, are kind of weird in that they tend to require the VDDQ voltage to be equal to the memory voltages, which makes 0 sense because this is an internal memory controller voltage that like doesn't see the memory sticks at all, as far as I know. So I have no idea why ASUS boards behave like that, but it is a thing that they do. On MSI and Gigabyte boards, you can generally run like 1.4 volts or less VDDQ for basically any memory speed. It really doesn't make much of a difference, but 1.35 volts generally is like a setting that works well across a wide range of memory speeds. Anyway, VDD2 is up at 1.55 volts. This is perfectly safe for the CPU, even though it looks really high, because this is basically the replacement voltage for what your DDR4 memory sticks run on, and there are 1.6 volt DDR4 memory sticks. Because of how DDR5 has its power delivery done, like this replaces part of the DDR4 power delivery. So yeah, 1.55 volts for this is perfectly safe. Though, well, on Gigabyte motherboards, a lot of the time you want this equal to your memory VDD voltage, which is this right here. I mean VDDQ voltage, you want like VDD2 and VDDQ to be the same thing. On like MSI and ASUS boards, you actually want it relatively low. Typically like 1.3 volt, well, somewhere in the range of like 1.2 to like 1.35 volts on MSI and Asus boards. So this is like a Gigabyte thing where running like a lot of VDD2 voltage can help with stability. It's not it's not necessarily necessary, but I usually run it really high because it doesn't like a lot of it can help, and a lot of the time it definitely doesn't tend to cause too many issues, at least if you're below like 1.6 volts. So yeah, unfortunately a lot of things involved with memory overclocking are very it depends on your specific setup, and DDR5 is like an extreme version of that because there's just so many more settings. Anyway, now we get to the memory voltages. Now, the thing about these memory sticks, these Gigabyte Aorus engineering sample sticks, is that they use a Renesas power management IC, and the Renesas power management chip is dumb as hell, and consequently, if you want 1.55 volts, you need to punch in 1.62. Why? I have no idea. Like, other power management ICs don't do this, but the Renesas one does. So, if you have, Renesas, and also this is handled differently on different boards. I think on Asus boards, you usually have, like, the voltage difference between what you set and what you actually get is less than what you get on Gigabyte boards. But yeah, the way Gigabyte handles the Renesas power management IC, you need to punch in 1.62 volts in order to get like 1.55 volts. There's like a 70 millivolt negative offset for just no apparent reason, and that's just a thing with memory sticks that use Renesas power management chips, which and this only happens once you go above 1.435 volts, because up to 1.435 volts, you're in the sort of like standard voltage range for DDR5 power management ICs. But once you go above 1.35 volts, you need to go into like what is basically like an overclocking mode or extreme voltage range mode. I think Asus calls it extreme voltage. Anyway, when you go into that like extended voltage range mode, the Renesas power management chips behave really weird, and the end result is this, where like I have 1.62 volts set in order to get 1.55 out of the power management chip, because that chip is dumb. So yeah, anyway, this is perfectly safe for the memory sticks, but they do run hot, and that's why you need that's why I have the fan pointed at them, right? Like, without the fan, there is a very good chance that these would not actually be stable. And if you're considering running voltages this high on your DDR5 in an actual like a closed system, I would highly recommend that you run your memory stress test at the same time as a GPU test, because if your GPU, like if you overclock without considering the heat output of your GPU, and then you go play games, well, it is very possible that your GPU will heat up the memory sticks to the point that they stop being stable when playing games, even if they're like perfectly stable when running stress tests with the GPU idle. So yeah, also your CPU could also affect memory temperatures depending on how your cooling system is set up. So yeah, and if you don't want to run this much voltage, there's a pretty easy fix for that. You can just lower the primary timings. Or you can loosen out the primary timings, because that's kind of the thing with DDR5. Like, most of that voltage requirement is to get that CL28, which really doesn't make that much of a performance difference. But since the previous the DDR5 CL24 video, I was running a ton of voltage. In fact, I think I might be running basically the same voltage settings for this one. Let me just check. You definitely do need a fan. Ah, hell, forgot. Oh, yeah, no, it's slightly less. So on the CL24 video, I was using 1.56 to 1.58 volts on the memory. Here we're using 1.55. So, yeah, like, if you're willing to give up the primary timings a bit, you can run a lot less voltage. And also, if you're lucky and you have good memory sticks, you can use less voltage. But most of my DDR5 requires a ton of voltage for low CAS latency and TRCD and that kind of thing. So that's what's going on with that. Anyway, yeah, so, TCL28, TRCD37, like, there are sticks out there that with the amount of voltage that I'm running right here will do will do CL28 at like 6800 megabits per second. None of my sticks boot 6800 megabits per second at CL28. So, at least not with I think with more voltage, yes, but at this level of voltage, I can't boot settings that aggressive. So, anyway, so yeah, CL28, TRCD37, TRP37. This is basically as tight as it gets for SK Hynix. Well, for the TRCD and TRP at this speed, like there are DIMMs that can go lower on the cast latency. Well, maybe not 26 at 6300, but like 26 at 6000 is probably doable, which these DIMMs won't do that. So anyway, TRAS 28, so you can't actually set a lower TRAS than 28 because the Intel memory controller doesn't support a lower TRAS value than that. Anyway, TCWL's at 16. So this is a really sort of recent thing that somebody else discovered. Skullbringer, I think he goes by Skullbringer for his articles on Igor's lab. So he basically noticed with some, I think, G-Skill SK Hynix DIMMs that it's possible to run insanely low cast write latency. And yeah, as it turns out, that seems to be just a general thing with a lot of SK Hynix memory sticks, because I can run TCWL16 on these. The Corsair SK Hynix DIMMs that I have at higher speeds were like, I'm able to run like CL24, cast write latency of like 24. So yeah, this looks really weird, but this seems to be a Hynix thing. Like this actually works just fine. So yeah, interesting things with SK Hynix memory chips. The TRRDs are both at 4. These do not go any lower. So yeah, this is as low as they get, and this is like basically peak performance right there for those two timings. For refresh cycle, we have 333 for TRFC2. The TRFC setting in the Gigabyte BIOS doesn't do anything, so that's why that's on auto. And actually, if you're wondering about why so many other timings are on auto, so TRC doesn't exist on Intel CPUs. TWR also doesn't exist on Intel CPUs. That is a timing that gets calculated by the motherboard. And on most boards, if you can set if you're setting the TWR, what actually happens is the motherboard takes whatever TWR value you punch in, and then it converts it into tertiary timings. So you're not actually changing the TWR timing, because Intel CPUs literally do not have a register for this setting. At this point, you might be wondering, why does that setting exist in the BIOS then? And the answer to that is, I have no idea. But yeah, so that doesn't exist. These all exist. WTRs, WTRL, CCD, none of these exist. Intel CPUs handle these through their tertiary timings. They don't actually have registers for these settings right here. A lot of motherboards will let you set them, and then they'll just calculate your tertiaries for you. Or you can just not set them and set your tertiaries instead. Like, both ways is perfectly acceptable, but I generally think it's better if you actually directly set the tertiary, like the timings that actually exist on the CPU, than letting the motherboard calculate your tertiaries and stuff for you, because that doesn't always work. Anyway, so TRFC doesn't work with Gigabyte DDR5 boards, so we use TRFC2 to set the refresh cycles. That's at 333, which is a perfectly normal TRFC value for SK Hynix DIMMs. If you tried to run this on a Samsung memory stick, it's not going to work. And if you tried to run this on a Micron stick, I don't know what's going to happen, because I've not tried that. Then we have refresh cycle per bank at 233. This is a perfectly normal value for SK Hynix DIMMs. It doesn't work on Samsung. RTP is on auto because Intel doesn't have an RTP register. Or at least, technically they have a timing that does the exact same thing, but it has a slightly different name. And consequently, in the Gigabyte, on Asus boards, this isn't really a concern. On Gigabyte boards, you just leave this setting on auto. TFAW is at 16. It doesn't go lower than that. Command rate is at 1T, which is pretty neat. It's not a huge, being able to run 1T at 6300 is actually kind of neat. Like, Gigabyte seemingly put a lot of work into getting 1T command rate working on all of their Z690 boards. On the flip side, it's not that big a performance difference. Like, you can actually get better memory latency with some boards at 2T command rate than at 1T command rate, depending on exactly how the memory is set up. But on this board, setting 1T command rate really doesn't have any stability penalty to it, because the board doesn't clock high enough to justify running 2T. So it's basically just it does 1T command rate. and that's better for performance than 2T command rate. And in 2T, it's not going to clock any higher, so it's better to run it with 1T here. But there are motherboards out there where actually you'd prefer to be in 2T command rate and get more performance that way. So this is very situational on the motherboard that you're using. But since this board does 1T basically for free, I am running 1T. Refresh interval is at 65,535. For whatever reason, Gigabyte didn't extend the TREFI register range, because Intel actually, with 12th gen, the TREFI register goes all the way up to like 260,000. At which point you can start running into weird weird performance issues, as well as stability issues. But something like 100,000 would probably be perfectly fine. But yeah, you can't set that on Gigabyte boards. So I have it set to 65,000 because at 65,000, it's not going to cause any issues, and you can't actually set it above that on Gigabyte Z690 boards. TXP's at 4. This timing doesn't go any lower, and it improves your memory latency a bit. So, and also it generally doesn't affect memory stability in any way, shape, or form. So this is one of those settings that you can just kind of punch in anytime it's available. Is just like, does your motherboard have a TXP setting? Set it to 4. Really shouldn't cause any stability issues and will improve your memory latency a bit. So then we get these like power down management settings, which they don't really do anything for performance, so they're on auto. Like, these do exist, but they're on auto because they don't really do anything. It's not like some of the other settings that are on auto that they're on auto because they don't actually do anything. Also, you don't need to set the TREFI X9. I'm not going to get into why, but you don't have to worry about that one. TWR PDEN is at 30, TRD pre is at 4. So the TRD pre timing, this is read to pre-charge, as like Intel likes to call it, whereas TRTP is read to pre-charge, as like AMD likes to call it. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm not sure if this is still a bug on the BIOS version that we're currently using on this board, which I think is F6. Let's just check. What are we on? We're on F8E. So on early Gigabyte Z690 BIOSes, if you tried to set the TRTP timing, it would actually cause the motherboard to fail to train. So yeah, I have the TRTP. So that's one of the main reasons to not use the TRTP setting on Gigabyte boards. And instead you just use the TRD pre setting, which sets your RTP to 4. So, and yeah, you can set this to 4. That works on SK Hynix DIMMs. It does not work on Samsung DIMMs. Yeah, also, I don't think the register for this timing supports values lower than 4, but I'd have to check. It's pretty neat that this works. This boosts performance a little bit. And then we get TWR pre, which is at 30. And basically TWR PDEN and TWR pre are the two timings that like replace the TWR timing. So Intel doesn't have a TWR register. They have TWR pre and TWR PDEN. So yeah, and on SK Hynix DIMMs, depending on what memory speed you're at and how much voltage you're running, you should be able to set these to anywhere from like 30 to like 48. You shouldn't have to use higher values than 48 in my experience. TCK is at 4. That doesn't go any lower than that. And then we get to the tertiaries, which are 11.7 for the read-to-read on the same group. Well, read-to-read same group is at 11. Read-to-read different group is at 7. Read to write, same group, different group are both at 17. This doesn't go any lower, and at higher memory clocks, you might end up having to run even looser settings, but at 6300, 17 works just fine. I think at around like 6800 to 7000, these end up having to go to like 18. Yeah, anyway, write to write is at 9, which is a SK Hynix DDR5 thing. For some reason, SK Hynix DDR5 is just very good at write commands. Like, you'll notice, like, the cast write latency goes down to 16, and it just works, which is bizarre. But similarly, we have the write to write delay on the same group at 9, and that works too. For comparison, on Samsung DDR5, TWR, like, write to write same group does not do 9. It doesn't, I don't think it even does 12. So yeah, as SK Hynix DDR5 for some reason is like exceptionally good at write commands. So that's neat. Anyway, different group is at 7. That doesn't go any lower. yeah, that's just DDR5 things. I'm pretty sure it's related to the fact that DDR5 has longer burst lengths than DDR4 did. So on DDR4, you typically set your different group timing to, like, different group timings typically do 4. On DDR5, they do 8 or 7, and they don't go less than 7. So, like, trying to set these lower than 7 is probably a waste of time. But anyway, then we get to write to read and same group and different group, and both of these tend to be really, really loose. They also scale with voltage, so if you want to run less voltage, you potentially have to, you'll have to loosen them out, depending on how good your memory sticks are. 5240 is very low for over 6,000 megabits per second, and yeah, like this is... The profile I have set up here is very aggressive. Let's just put it that way. I would not expect it to work on all motherboards or all memory kits. Yeah. So, but this is more of a, like, really the settings we're looking at here is, this is more along the lines of like what can be done with DDR5 than rather than like, you should be able to do this. I don't think you necessarily will be able to do this. But something like this is certainly possible with SK Hynix DDR5 DIMMs on Gigabyte motherboards. So, yeah, so that's all of the memory settings. Other than that, I just have fast boot disabled to force the board to retrain every time. So that, well, if you leave fast boot turned on, and you don't change your like cache latency, the board will not change memory timings for you. So that's kind of the main reason why I have that disabled. Anyway, that's it, I think, in terms of settings. Yeah. So other than that, I just have 105 BCLK because there's no... Well, okay, that's not true. There is a 6300 memory ratio. It doesn't work. On MSI and like Asus boards, the BIOS won't let you, like, for whatever reason, Intel has a bunch of memory ratios on the CPU that don't actually work. MSI and Asus motherboards don't let you select those ratios. Gigabyte boards do. So, like, 6200, like, 6000 works. Like, 6000 is real. 6133 is real. 6100 isn't. 6000, 6133, 6200, those all work. 6266 doesn't. 6300 doesn't. 6400 does. 6500 doesn't. 6533 doesn't. 6600 does. 6666 does. 6800 does. 6700 doesn't. 6900 doesn't work. 6933 does work. 7000 does work. 766 doesn't. Like, so yeah, there's just a bunch of memory ratios that on better designed BIOSes, you won't be able to see because they don't work. But this is a Gigabyte board, so Gigabyte just kind of leaves all of the settings available, even if they don't necessarily work. Anyway, admittedly, I could have hit 6300 megabits per second with like a different mix of BCLK and memory ratio, but this also works out to the best CPU speed, because alternatively, I guess I could have tried like 48... with like 101.5 or something, but that puts the CPU at less than that puts the CPU core clock at less than 4.9 gigahertz, and I wanted to run the CPU as fast as possible for the sake of like LinPack and all the other benchmarks. So that's why why I went with 105 BCLK instead of like a lower BCLK value. Also on Intel 12th Gen on Intel 12th Gen CPUs in general, the BCLK doesn't affect your PCIe clocks, your SATA clocks, or anything like that. So it's perfectly safe to run high BCLK if like there's like a weird memory speed that you want to hit, and you can't hit it with the available ratios, just use the BCLK to do it instead. The one downside to adjusting the BCLK is that it breaks IDA's memory, but actually it breaks all of the IDA benchmarks, I think. So yeah, if you raise your BCLK if you raise your BCLK, your IDA results stop being valid, basically. Will IDA ever fix that? I don't know. So yeah, anyway, that covers pretty much every... You know what? I actually want to do a 5.1 gigahertz run of Pi Prime, so I'm just going to quickly calculate how to get 5.1 gigahertz at 105 BCLK, or at least close to it. So 5.1 divided by 105, 48. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. It's like 48.6. That's not a valid ratio, damn it. Oh, well, well, the alternative is I can just run pi prime at 6200. Oh, actually, you know what? We'll do IDA at like 100, 5.1, so that I have comparable results for all the other. Nope, not the E-cores. Also, I have the E-cores disabled because if you don't disable the E-cores, you can't run high ring clock. And the ring clock does help a bit with memory latency. So yeah, anyway, with what I just punched in, this will not run linpack, just by the way. So we're not going to run linpack, we're just going to quickly run IDA on this. So you have some idea of like how 6200 CL28 performs in IDA, because yeah, as much as I hate IDA, a lot of people really like it. And since it's popular, I'll give you some, performance numbers for IDA. So yeah, that just fires right up. Oh, it did the double boot thing. It sometimes does that. I'm not entirely sure that 1.35 volts is going to be enough for 5.1. Should be close enough. Yeah, because we're like the IDA latency test is not very heavy. The bandwidth test I'm not sure about. That's the one part I'm not sure about. Also, at 6200, these settings are going to be a lot easier to run on more boards. 6300 is really sort of pushing the limits of what the 4DIMM Gigabyte boards can do. So anyway, let's hit IDA. So yeah, we get 98 gigabytes per second. I can't read that. It's gonna window the projector. Go. Yeah, so we get like 98 gigabytes per second read, almost 99 gigabytes per second writes, and a 58.5 nanosecond latency. The thing is, if you're not in safe mode, you need to run the latency test a bunch of times. And actually, if you have a bunch of crap running on your system, running the latency test a bunch of times still won't help you. You really need to run the latency test without a bunch of other applications open. Yeah. So for comparison, I think the CL24 setup was hitting, 58.7 nanoseconds. So this is already slightly better, though this really should be hitting like 56. So I'm not particularly thrilled about the 57s coming up, but... Oh yeah, there we go. 56 nanoseconds. Still, like, it is very possible to hit under, like, 55 nanoseconds on DDR5. It's just, like, Gigabyte boards really seem to struggle with the round-trip latency training, in my experience. So what I mean by that is there's a bunch of... And you can't really do anything about this. This is just a motherboard thing. You have these timings right here. And on Gigabyte boards, you just end up with worse, like... I'm pretty sure it's due to the RTL training. I've not actually checked. But, yeah, it's been very consistent for me that the same settings on, like, an MSI or an Asus board will get better memory latency results than on a Gigabyte board. It used to be way worse at launch when... Like, on, say, the Z690 Master that we're using here, getting under 60 nanoseconds on this board on the launch BIOSes was... Honestly, I don't think it was possible. Like, straight up, I don't think you could have gotten under 60 nanoseconds at all with the launch BIOSes on Gigabyte boards. Whereas, like, MSI and Asus boards, you could get sub 60 nanosecond latency relatively easily. And right now with like Asus and MSI boards, it's quite easy to hit under 55 nanoseconds. On Gigabyte boards, it's still quite hard. And it just seems to be something to do with how Gigabyte boards train either it's the RTL timings. I've not actually like compared what RTLs train at what settings, or it's some other memory like memory controller configuration thing that's like driving up the latency numbers in IDA. So yeah. Anyway, this is still a solid result for DDR5 in general, though. And what else did I want to run? Oh, right, I wanted to run Pi Prime. Because I want comparable numbers to the 12900K. Or comparison numbers for the 12900K, I should say. Oh, that's not that much. That's not that different. Interesting. Yeah, 8678. Anyway, yeah, that's it for this video. So yeah, I think I've proved my point that like trying to run your DDR5 at CL24 is dumb, because it is like you have worse memory latency than if you're at something like 6200 CL28 or 6300 CL28. You have way less bandwidth, just straight up, like you have way less memory bandwidth. And so basically you just end up with worse performance at like 5200 CL24 compared to something like 6200 CL28. Also, like 6200 CL30 would be a lot easier to run, and it wouldn't really require, wouldn't really change the latency results that much either. So, yeah. Anyway, that's it for the video. Hopefully this is somewhat helpful if you have a Gigabyte Z690 motherboard and SK Hynix based memory sticks, because yeah, like that's the thing, is it really doesn't matter what brand your memory kit, like, well, okay, that's not entirely true. It mostly doesn't matter what brand your memory kit is. What matters is what memory chips are on it and how many of them you're trying to overclock at the same time. If you're running single rank SK Hynix DIMMs, pretty much regardless of who made them, you should be able to hit similar results to what I've shown here if you're using a 4-DIMM Gigabyte motherboard, be that a Master or a Z690 Aorus Extreme or a Designator or the Vision-D board. Vision D? No, Aero D. Yeah, the Aero D board. On the cheaper boards from Gigabyte, so the 6-layer boards, like 6200 might not actually be doable. You probably would get stuck at like 6000 if you have like a Z690 Ultra or a Pro or one of the lower end Gigabyte boards like that. So yeah, anyway, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HLC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. And I also have a Bandcamp, where I post like industrial background noise type stuff. So yeah, if you'd like to check that out, there's a link to that in the description as well. And that's it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.